Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to launch some offensive operations across the border into the Sumy region with no additional advances as they haven't been able to consolidate their positions, but this indicates a larger operation here in the Sumy direction. The Russians also have managed to advance east of Kupiansk to the north of Stepove Novoselivka, as well as to the south of Pokrovsk, fully capturing the town of Zaporizhia, to the northwest of Velika Novosilka, advancing further, and in the western parts of the Zaporizhia region, they've managed to advance further within the town of Yatatki. The Russians have managed to advance in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, where they've managed to advance further within Pyatatki and are moving onwards to the western outskirts of the town. The Russians launched a combined assault from the southern and eastern parts of the town to gain control over the southern and eastern parts of the town, and they're now moving into the western parts with a combined assault from the western parts near Sherbianka and the eastern parts of Pyatatki. The objective is to gain control over the first patch area, then move onwards to Lubkova and gain control over the fortified positions there. This will allow the Russians to gain full control over both Lubkova and Pyatatki. We may see some Russian operations to regain control over Kamyansk in the western parts as well. Moving on to the Donetsk section, we see that the Russians have managed to advance northeast and northwest of Novocherezovate. Russians have managed to gain control over the forest patch area in between the fortified positions to the northeast and Novocherezovate. They've also managed to gain a foothold within Skutne, and according to Deep State Map, the entire area is in a gray zone as the Russians have managed to advance further and are fighting over the entire area. The Russians will likely gain control over the southern bank of the Mukhayeli River line and Skutne within the next few days, following which the fighting will begin over the next line of defense, which is the final line of defense of the Ukrainians in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russians are also continuing offensive operations alongside the fortified positions, where they look to gain control over the remaining few fortified positions, as well as Borlatsky, and then move onward towards Privne and Vilnepole. The quick collapse of the defensive lines of the Ukrainians here northwest of Velika Novosilka has allowed the Russians to take advantage of this and advance further. We'll likely see the Russians try to keep up their momentum to gain control over the area in between their first and second lines of defense, and this will allow the Russians to start pressuring the Ukrainian positions where they are the most secure. At the same time, we see that there's been no additional advances in the area west of Korokhove. The Russians are here continuing to establish their supply lines for further offensive operations to gain control over Konstantinopel and then move onwards towards Bahadir and the rear of this final defensive line. The Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Zaporizhia, and we'll likely see that the Russians will here look to attack Preobrazhenka from the northern and southern flanks. This will allow them to then gain control over that town as well and move on to the final three towns here to the west of Zaporizhia towards the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians are here about 6.5 kilometers from the Dnipropetrovsk region, and we see that there's the town of Tretske and Horikhovo, following which the Russians will reach the border area. Therefore, we see that the Russians are in the end game in terms of gaining control over the border area here in between Pokrovsk and Korokhove. After which, the Russians could either start crossing over the border and start a siege over Novopavlivka to gain control over this connection between the Ukrainian forces near Pokrovsk and the connection between the forces in Korokhove, allowing for a stronger Russian connection towards the Dnipropetrovsk region and to hit the supplies of the Russian forces in the area. Also allow the Russians to expand their offensive operations towards the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. We see that the Russians continue offensive operations here in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region to gain full control of it, and we may see the Russians cross over the border simply to bypass defensive positions. However, we'll likely see that the Russians will focus their efforts on gaining control over the few towns remaining in between Pokrovsk and Korokhove, and then move onwards with the fortified positions in the northern highway near Korokhove, and move alongside the southern highway to flank the fortified positions within the Donetsk region itself. following which the Russians can gain full control over the Donetsk region, following which the Russians can focus their efforts in the northern direction or move into either the Dnipro region or the Zaporizhia region from the flanks. This will allow them to bypass several layers of fortified positions that the Ukrainians have built over the past few years of the war. At the same time, the Ukrainians managed to recapture the central parts of Uspinivka, kicking the Russians out to the eastern parts of the town. There's been a lot of back and forth within Uspinivka as the Ukrainians have continuously attempted to counterattack within the town, and it is a well-fortified one with several fortified positions. This allowed the Ukrainians to hold on to Uspinivka for a long time, despite Russian efforts to gain control over the town. It is also one of the few remaining towns near the outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region. And here we see the town is also around the 6-kilometer mark away from the Dnipropetrovsk border, where the closest part is in the direction of Udashne, where the Russians are just within 4.5 kilometers of the Dnipropetrovsk region. Moving on to the Toretsk direction, following the capture of the city, the Russians are still clearing the basements and securing the entire city, as there is a lot for them to cover, and they captured it fairly quickly, which means that they still have to consolidate their gains within the city, and this is why the Russians have not launched any significant offensive operations beyond it. And we now see that the Ukrainians are attempting to take advantage of this to launch some counterattacks into the city. There are some operations taking place in the northeastern outskirts of the city, where the Ukrainians are attempting to regain a foothold within the city and push the Russians out of the outskirts and restart the battle over it. Moving on to the eastern parts of the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians managed to gain control over several forest lines and large fields here to the north of Stepovo Novosilivka. Through this operation, the Russians now surround Stepovo Novosilivka from 3 separate directions, from the northern, southern, and eastern direction. If the Russians gain control over the fortified position, then the Ukrainians would be operationally encircled and would have no supply line out of the town. Russians could also enter it from the northern flank now, as well as flank it from the rear to gain control over the road here west of Stepovo Novosilivka to physically cut the town. The Russians will likely gain control over Stepovo Novosilivka now that the Russians have gained control over the northern flank, from which the Russians can start offensive operations alongside the railways towards Peshane and onwards towards Kurilivka and Kupiansk. At the same time, we see that the pressure has increased from the southern flank and the northern flank, which indicates further offensive operations will likely take place where the Russians are looking to gain control over the Kupiansk pocket. At the same time, there is some positional fighting in the direction of Kindrashivka and Holyubivka, as the Russians, following the capture of Kalinove, are launching some operations with reconnaissance groups towards these towns, where they're looking to gain more information and to probe the Ukrainian defenses in the area. We see continuous offensive operations from the western bank of the Oskil River line as well, and therefore we see that one of the areas that is prioritized by the Russian forces right now seems to be the Kupiansk direction, where we've seen a lot of advances through this month. In the northern section of the front line in the Kursk and Sumy direction, the Russians have started offensive operations towards Shuravka, where it is only smaller groups of infantry that are doing some reconnaissance fighting similar to the area north of Kupiansk in the western bank of the Oskil River line. But this indicates that the Russians are not just planning to gain control over Yunakivka and advance alongside the Luknia River line to cut off the supply lines in and out of the Kursk region, but it may be a general offensive operation towards gaining control over both of these river lines. As we see here in the direction of Shuravka, there is a river line that moves through from the border area and down all the way to the south towards Yablanivka, where we see that the Russians could gain control over the area in between both of these river lines to have a strong flank in the western and eastern direction and completely cut off the supplies here in this direction. Such an operation would significantly limit the Ukrainian capabilities to supply their forces in the Kursk region and also significantly improve the Russian positions here in the Sumy-Kursk direction. This will allow the Russians to cut off and operationally encircle the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. This will inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainian forces that are committed to the fighting in the region and also allow the Russians to regain control of it. So we see in the frontline situation right now, the Ukrainians are attempting some new counterattacks. They have generally been attempting counterattacks since the start of this year. However, the Russians still have the initiative, they still have the advantage over the Ukrainian forces, allowing them to advance further and faster than the Ukrainians are, and the Ukrainian defensive positions are varying in their ability to defend. As we see in Velika Novosilka, it completely collapsed, while in other sections of the front line, like Pokrovsk, where it is more of a stalemate, and in the Turецk direction, the Ukrainians are attempting to prevent a Russian breakthrough. But at the same time, we also see that Chasiv Yar has been fairly silent this month. We see that there is a lot more back and forth right now as the Ukrainians are attempting to stabilize the situation and improve the situation in the wake of the negotiations that are taking place right now. And that is actually a very interesting part, because we see that these negotiations could actually slow down the end of the war, because as long as negotiations take place, it is difficult for either side to launch any large operation, because that would show insincerity in terms of the negotiations. You can't go to a meeting where you say you want peace and you want the war to end, to then launch an operation to attack Sumy or to enter the Russian territory again from the Ukrainian side. So we see that the negotiations are currently putting a stop to any major operation from either side. Instead, what is likely to happen is that we'll see lots slower advances until some sort of outcome has come out from the negotiations. Either they fall apart, and we will see from that, depending on whether it falls apart in favor of the Russians or the Ukrainians, we would see vastly different outcomes. If it breaks down in favor of the Russians and the Ukrainians refuse to negotiate, then aid to Ukraine could be cut off from the United States, and this would significantly limit their defensive and offensive capabilities. While if the negotiations fall apart in favor of the Ukrainians and the Russians refuse to negotiate, then they may receive more US aid and so on, and this could significantly impact the situation across the front line. But in either case, the Russians are building up their military capabilities, and they're doing so at a faster pace than the Ukrainians. If there are less offensive operations, that means they'll be growing up their forces considerably faster to a larger size, and we may see larger offensive operations following the conclusion of the peace deals if it falls apart. However, if it succeeds, then we will just see the end of the war instead. In either case, we'll likely see an outcome of the negotiations within the next few weeks, at the latest probably around May. Before May, it is unlikely that the negotiations will drag on to beyond that of the month of May. If it does, then there'll be less regard for it, and it will likely be taken less seriously, and therefore larger operations could happen either way. In the summer period, that is when we will see more movement across the front line, unless the war has ended. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.